All right, I think we can get started now. Good afternoon, everyone. People are still trickling in. We're going to start at the hour so we can do well on time. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Cristina Stancu, and I'm an associate professor of English and the director of the Humanities Research Center at VCU. And I'm just delighted to welcome you to our second event of the semester at the HRC in the Meet VCU Authors series. In partnership with VCU Libraries, our Meet VCU Authors series typically invites members of the Richmond community, as well as colleagues and students from VCU and other local universities to meet VCU authors and artists as they talk about their publications and answer questions about their work. Although we still can meet in person, we look forward to recognizing our VCU authors in the College of Humanities and Sciences and beyond in this format before we can resume our talks in person. I'd like to thank Rani Sisavat, our administrative and communications assistant, as well as Alexis Fink, our director of communications in the College of Humanities and Sciences, for their help behind the scenes. And I should say that Rani and the communications team in CHS have really been essential in ensuring that our robust programming continues as the HRC is preparing to become a university-wide research center at VCU. So keep your fingers crossed for us. Our events follow more or less a similar format. So I'll briefly introduce our guest today, who will then speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions from the audience. And if you have a question while Dr. Lemu gives his presentation, please post it in the Q&A and we'll address them in the order in which they are received. And now on to the good stuff. I'm very excited to welcome to the HRC Dr. Massa Lemu, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Sculpture and Extended Media at Virginia Commonwealth University. Dr. Lemu is a visual artist and writer whose multidisciplinary artistic practice takes the form of text, performance, sculpture, and multimedia installations that are concerned with the contradictions of migration and the psychological effects of an immaterial, flexible, and mobile capitalism on the post-colonial subject. I'm reading here for the biography prepared for us by Dr. Lemu himself. He makes interventions into objects, texts, and spaces, as he says, to re-enchant his life. That sounds beautiful. And sometimes he uses the aesthetics of politics to comment on the politics of aesthetics. Dr. Lemu has exhibited at the 1708 Gallery and the Oakwood Arts Gallery in Richmond and the Lawndale Arts Center at Rice University in Houston, among others. He's a member of the Ozhopé collective, whose work has been shown at the University of Malawi, Bodaboda Panafrican Video Art Festival, the Collective Bureau in Cape Town, the Guggenheim Museum in New York City, Salt City in Basel, Switzerland, and at, I might ruin this, but my German is not very good, and at Galerie for Zeitgenössische Kunst in Leipzig. As a writer, Dr. Lemu's scholarly interests lie in what he calls a biopolitical collectivism in contemporary African art, which he defines as a subject-centered and collectivist art practice situated in everyday life. His writings have been published by Field Journal of Socially Engaged Art, the Burlington Contemporary, Wits University Press, Third Text, and many other venues. Dr. Lemu has a Ph.D. in visual arts from Stellenbosch University in South Africa. And if you don't know much about him, but you'd like to learn more after this presentation, you can visit his website at www.massalemu.com. And Dr. Lemu, welcome to the HRC, and thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Thank you so much, Christina. Yeah, that's a mouthful of a bio, isn't it? Yeah,
Welcome.
Thank you. I am going to talk about the material and expressive aspects of articulage, but I will start by sharing images of a work that I did around 2017 and 2018, titled "The Sea Harms Bearing Strange Gifts." This is a collection of, I could say, a series of assemblages which altogether formed this an installation, a body of work, which is an installation that I exhibited at the Oakwood Arts Center in 2018 in here in Richmond. I was invited by the director there, Shannon Castleman, to be the first artist in residence. And I spent my time working on this project. But the term articulage itself came to me when I was just looking at this work in 2019, when I was a resident at the Bemis at 2019 at the Bemis Arts Residency in Nebraska. I would like to draw your attention particularly to some aspects of the work that really become the center or the material of this term articulage. And this is the rubber straps that connect the court and this armature of an odd suitcase. So the rubber straps are created from stripping rubber tubing from rubber tires. I thought this was an apt metaphor to speak to issues of mobility and migration. And of course, other issues related to home. When I was given, this space to work in, and when Shannon presented me with this a series of quotes, about 15 or 20 baby coats, which had been in this space that I exhibited the work. The space was had been an odd nursery, which served the kids in the neighborhood at Churchill in Richmond. So the courts had been sitting in this dilapidated building, which was to be transformed into a residency. And I looked at these materials and, thought about the issues that were urgent to me at the time, which were issues of migration and mobility and my connection to home. And Tempera, as I mentioned, was one element that I thought would be a starting point to connect or to reflect or to represent my position as a Malawian migrant living in the US. But then the other material that I had been using was the suitcase, which, as I will show later, has been a recurrent material and motif in my work, which are then connected to the baby coats, but I had to transform the baby coats as well into these baby coats adorned with mylar blankets. So you have the baby coats with mylar blankets. They had their own original fabric that had been all worn and dirty, and I changed that and I put the baby coats, the mylar blankets on top to to heighten these the metaphors of home and mobility and refugees and migration and so on and so forth. I should mention that I created this work at the time when the news in the media was awash with images of children in detention centers in Texas, and that resonated with my own thinking about these issues. So the mylar blanket is a loud and dehumanizing material. So I sought to rehumanize it in a way as to, by extension, to think about processes of rehumanizing those who have experienced the traumas of, moving from being displaced, moving from home to seek shelter and refuge in other lands. So it was, for me, a process of rehumanization, like a process of contending with my situation as somebody who had just moved in. Of course, my position as an intellectual, as a university professor, would not compare with those who are deemed as illegal immigrants and they're undocumented. But there have been instances in my own life when I have, taken pause and reflected on, what it means to move from, places like Malawi to the US. Yeah, so this installation is a series of assemblages, which, as I mentioned, is the baby cord, the rubber straps cord impera in Malawi, and the let me go back, and the luggage bag, which has been stripped to just remain with the armature or the frame. The stripping for me echoes, the kind of stripping that a migrant would endure, passing through authorities and the search, and how they dig into the luggage and how your privacy is violated, that you are literally brought inside out, everything. I had experienced this when I traveled in around 2010. I traveled to LA, and not as a migrant as such, but just as a Black man traveling through airports in America. Security, randomly just chose me and say, we're going to do a random search, and how they dug into the luggage and placed my objects on the floor. That kind of dehumanizing experience that has been a constant in my work to try to contend with that experience. But I worked with a team of assistants who helped me to make this work, to sew the mylar blankets onto the baby cots. You can see in this corner of the image is the original fabric, the green fabric that formed the original baby cot, which I removed and then replaced with the mylar blankets. The mylar blankets is you see it in images of the children in Texas, but also if you follow, the kind of issues of migration through the Mediterranean, there are always images of migrants or refugees draped in this material. It's a practical material, but it also has, for me, that dehumanizing, image that you don't want to be in that position. Yeah, but as I mentioned, I had the stripped luggage bag, on top of which I added these tags, which carry different statements I will show later. But yeah, this is an original or early work that I did in Houston after I had traveled to LA and experienced this stripping. But also, as you know, Houston is in Texas, close to the border, and the issues of migration there are acute. So I just contrasted, it was a parallel experience, contrasting my own stories and experiences as a migrant, but also those of the illegal immigrants and documented workers, so-called illegal immigrants and documented workers, and the acute stories of migration that are in Houston as a society, or Texas largely. So what I did was to strip the luggage bag of its covering and replaced with barbed wire, which I welded onto the frame, and then added these tags, which I had stamped expected as an extension of inspected. Like, the bags have been inspected and then they've been stamped. But expected here was a play with words, just to reflect on how the labor, migrant labor is expected, in the capitalist system. Undocumented migrant labor is expected because it is profitable. So I glued these different labor tools onto the armature, just to complete. But this is talking about issues of labor and migration and capitalism broadly. Yeah. So, but in the new luggage bags, the tags they have different statements. This one is statement from among the Malawi fishers. It says the canoe does not eat, to speak to the canoe as an investment, as a viable investment, because you don't have to spend much on it. Once you have the canoe, it will just help you bring the fish in. So it does not eat, it does not need a lot of maintenance. It's low maintenance. This one is The Sea Eats the Land at Home. So when I was making this exhibition, I had also been influenced by a poem that I read as an undergraduate student at the University of Malawi by Kofi Auna, a Ghanaian poet. So Kofi Auna has this poem, evocative poem, that describes the destabilization and the displacement that happens during a flood. The title is The Sea Eats the Land at Home, but for now, in the context of global warming and climate change, I thought this is saying so much, because so many reasons why people are being displaced from their lands, wars and famine, but yeah, climate change and global warming also figure largely, but these are also human-made disasters. So yeah, this statement formed part of the list or repertoire of statements that were added a textual layer to the different aspects or dimensions of this work. One other statement, related to travel was to see dogs with belly buttons. This is a Malawian proverb that encourages one to travel, to go live in other lands, at least whether briefly or, however. But traveling is important because you see things that if you just remain in your village, you would not be able to experience or to see or to learn. So those who have traveled have expanded their horizons. So this was perhaps a lighter moment in such a heavy topic, a heavy exhibition about migration, immigration, the refugee experience, and so on. So as I mentioned, this is a nursery school. It had these blackboards, which I regarded as palimpsest, which had accumulated layers and layers of meaning due to time, and as a dilapidated building with blackboards that, so many things had been written on them. I couldn't just leave them blank. I had to write my own statements. And Dad was a drifter, but that's neither here nor there, is one of such statements. Just reflecting on how I have discovered that my life is as similar to my father's, that he was a drifter. He never stayed in one place. I look back at my own life and, I have also lived in, different places. In the past 10 years, South Africa, Houston, perhaps Georgia, and finally here in Richmond, Virginia. So yeah, but Dad is a drifter. That's neither here nor there. I just kept erasing on the main word, drifter, just contending with it. And, daddy issues, but that's neither here nor there. Yeah, the other one was Dad was a wanderer, but let's not go there. My work is as I mentioned, one layer that's predominant in my work is text. I like to play with text in my work to, beyond the extra linguistic that perhaps working up with objects bring into the work. Text is a kind of opening into how one can read, but it also introduced a humor element, a linguistic element, but also a humor element. But just playing with the poetry of words to expand or extend their meanings. So that was a wanderer, but let's not go there. It's like I want to touch on this topic, but also I'm not sure if I am ready to engage with it. But this was also, I was just imagining that, these are kids, everything that is in the installation belonged to the kids who who had lived in this building, and they wrote their own statements on this blackboard. And I am a kid, one of them, who's also contributing to the stories and the narratives that they contributed or that accumulated into on the different surfaces of this building. But yeah, the empira is a central material of articulage. This is just an image, an old image, perhaps the only image that I have that has a better, gives a better picture of how the exhibition was installed. This is at the opening with the different baby coats and the stripped luggage bags and pillar. And one other element was the African, the so-called African cloth, which is, traditionally used by women to carry babies, and or it's a practical material also that I thought would also bring its own meanings into the work. But I think about the term articulage as being heir to terms such as Ousmane Sembene's méhotage or mégotage, depending on your French expression. Mégotage cinema was how Ousmane Sembene, the Senegalese filmmaker, described his work. That it was like how Senegalese young men picked up discarded cigarette butts, and from the discarded cigarette butts, created their own cigarettes, like to, put together what other people had thrown away and, put together a cigarette and smoked it. For him, most of the materials were donated from, by friends from Europe or elsewhere. And, his film was created by stringing together donated film reels and, film equipment. So méhotage or mégotage as a predecessor of the term articulage. But what is articulage? So the term articulage combines the term assemblage as deployed by Deleuze and Guattari with the term articulation, especially as used by Stuart Hall. Articulage highlights articulation as assembly, as a process of flexibly linking different elements together. Translated to the terrain of the visual arts, articulage describes artistic strategies and process of assemblage, focusing on the materials, forms, and structures that facilitate aesthetic linkages between diverse materials and forms characterized by flexibility and elasticity. So, for example, in the empira, as a quintessential articulage material for me, the empira is like it psychically, I'm thinking about how I'm psychically connected to home, but but the elasticity, the elastic connection that is, that psychic connection between, to home, between here and the US, it can be, that bond can be stretched to its limits, it can break, but there is that elastic or flexible connection. So in this talk, I look at contemporary African art, animism, and decolonial thought to chart the development of articulage and to reflect on what constitutes empowering and disempowering assemblages in the present. Firstly, let me try to define Stuart Hall's articulation. So Hall's articulation describes how different structures can be linked together and influence each other in a social formation in relations of domination. For instance, articulation describes how the economy and politics influence and shape one another, without either entirely determining how the other operates. There is a material dimension that emphasizes the politics of articulation as praxis, as a way of thinking and acting upon people's material conditions. Most specifically, Hall cites Harold Warp, who introduced the term to South African debates to describe how capitalism was linked to racism in the differentiation of Black and white working class labor through race, and how it was linked to agrarian peasantry in relations of subordination, domination, and exploitation in apartheid South Africa. By emphasizing the specificities of place and time when studying the relations of production, articulation helps name crucially formative social relationships without over-exaggerating any causal links between the two. So now let me briefly describe the Deleuzian assemblage. Deleuze and Guattari conceptualized the theory of assemblage as characterized by an exteriority of relations between and among heterogeneous or diverse elements. So face-to-face conversations, the symbiosis of plants and pollinating insects, cities, and nation states can all be categorized as assemblage. They are assemblies, they're created by assembling diverse or heterogeneous elements. There is the material and expressive dimension to the Deleuzian assemblage. For instance, a group would be composed of the bodies, the material aspect, the bodies of human beings, and the gestures or speech acts by the bodies. So the material dimension being the bodies, or the gestures and speech acts by the bodies being the expressive aspect. In addition, the Deleuzian assemblage is marked by territorializing or internally stabilizing and deterritorializing or internally destabilizing dimensions. For example, how a conversation can be destabilized by a slip of the tongue. Perhaps at this point, I can offer a definition of articulage. I do so by answering the question, how is articulation and assemblage useful for articulage? For me, both deal with linkages of heterogeneous elements. On the one hand, a fluid and expanded understanding of assemblage. On the other, an emphasis on flexible linkages of social formations. Theoretically, linking Hall's articulation with Deleuze and Guattari's assemblage, articulage occupies a space between Arthuserian structuralism, characterized by rigid structures, and complexity theory, characterized by fluid assemblages. So articulage is about thinking assemblage as a relation of being, where the subject does not have definitive control over the object. It defines the flexible linkages of diverse and heterogeneous elements without one element holding a dominant position. Consider a knee joint. In this assemblage, the ligaments and the articular cartilage, articular cartilage is one term that perhaps is close to articulage. Cartilage would be almost an anagram of the term articulage if you just perhaps ignore the U. But yeah, anyway, the ligaments and the articular cartilage are the tissues that facilitate flexible linkages for the femur and the tibia, as you can see in the image. Articulage thus focuses on the ligaments and the articular cartilage that facilitates these links. Articulage is about the languages, technologies, and mechanisms of articulation of bodies and other structures. It is about the mediums, the go-betweens, and the intermediaries of articulated linkages. In nature, pollen and nectar would be articulage elements of a flexible, symbiotic relationship between the wasp and the orchid. Just as the ticks would be on the back of the hippo in the mutual relation with the oxpecker. Hoping that that description is clear, I would now like to turn to articulage and new animism. This is an image of a baby hippo, which I saw online. A baby hippo that is being bothered by these oxpeckers that want to have a snack on its back. So the ticks, in this sense, would be like the nectar in the assemblage of pollen and nectar, and the wasp and the flower, and so on. But I am, as I mentioned, I'm interested in the intermediaries and the go-betweens. So articulage and new animism. Old African societies were derided for endowing trees and wood with spiritual powers and attributing magical forces to so-called inanimate objects such as stones, carapaces, shells, quills, and feathers. To augment their personhood and to empower themselves, members of such societies used to adorn and surround themselves with different objects in order to draw from their powers and energies. The old animist practices were not unities of dominance whereby the human exercised his unlimited agency over passive objects. Rather, there was reciprocity of agencies between the subject and its object. Interestingly, subjectivities in advanced contemporary society seek to enhance themselves similarly by extending themselves through technological objects such as computers, cell phones, and other prosthetics. As Achille Mbembe, the Cameroonian thinker, has observed, and I quote, "Neoliberalism has created the conditions for a renewed convergence and at times fusion between the living human beings and objects, artifacts or technologies that supplement or augment us and are in the process transfigured and transformed by us," end of quote. In other words, we have become the new animists through the assemblage that we create every day with technology. Nevertheless, not all animist assemblages are for our benefit. Certain animist assemblages are intended for malevolent ends, exemplified in certain forms of odd and new fetishes. As we see in an examination of a post-colonial class I call the patois bourgeoisie, described later. Now I'd like to share a few reflections of on Dineo Seshe Bopape's work. So Dineo Seshe Bopape is, this is an example. The image that you see is an example of her work titled Plus or Minus 1791, Monument to the Haitian Revolution. I see Dineo Bopape's works as exemplifying positive animist assemblages, but importantly, I also would like to link certain elements in the work to articulage. So Dineo Seshe Bopape is one artist, one contemporary African artist who I am constantly just thinking about digging into their work to buttress, nourish my thinking around articulage. Her assemblages and installations consist of diverse materials, including soil, plants, animal matter, images and sound, which draw together the celestial, and the earthly, the bodily and the metaphysical, the personal and the collective. The heterogeneous materials in Bopape's mostly site-specific work articulate and are articulated to issues of land, race, memory, and the spiritual in coloniality, in an aesthetics and ethics inspired by Winnie Mandela, Nina Simone, Frantz Fanon, the Haitian Revolution, and Sangoma or traditional era practices. This heterogeneity of materials, objects, and ideas can be seen in works such as Plus or Minus 1791, Monument to the Haitian Revolution, and Azania. This is Azania. This is a detail of the work, both of which look at land, history, and memory for decolonial futures. Azania is the name African nationalists and freedom fighters gave to South Africa. Structurally, in Azania, the jointed swivel and adjustable clamp is for me an articulage element suspending and holding together lamplights, bottles of water, and wooden spoonfuls of dung and soil. In this light, both in form and content, Bopape's work, such as Azania, embodies articulage through flexible assemblages that symbolically link with organic and inorganic matter and spirit, and ancestral and anti-colonial or decolonial practices. This articulage attitude inspires my own studio practice. I must also mention the work of Gaël Schwarzne, who just recently came into my under my radar, whose work also has similar, flexible, loosely attached, diverse or heterogeneous materials and objects and images and surfaces and textures and colors. I am just getting deeper into understanding the mechanisms of tying things together, sewing and composing, layering, and adding matter on top of matter to create images and assemblages with a diversity of material and content. This is just a detail of some of the elements that constitute what I would say articulage elements in Gaël Schwarzne. Gaël Schwarzne is a Haitian French artist, presently based in Europe. So let me now share images of my own work titled Articulage, Thingifier and Thingified, or a bouquet of sublimated desires. Is another mouthful of a title, because my titles form, morph, change, get transformed as I work, with my on my work, but also it is another meaning-making element, component in my practice. So I think about poetry when I am titling my work. A Thingifier and Thingified, for example, is a play on signifier and signified. But I am borrowing from Aimé Césaire, and is the process of thingification, where a human being is turned into a thing, a mere thing, an object. For example, in chattel slavery, that turns human beings into somebody else's property and somebody else's object, tool, to be used and discarded. And, this is an image of me working in 2019 at the Bemis residency in Nebraska, where the term articulage emerged as I was, reflecting on past work and digging into different elements to move forward with my practice. This is some of the kinds of assemblages and experimentations that I did, but most significant to this conversation is the lamp, the lantern, which is another important articulage element in terms of how this lantern, this kerosene lamp, is an assemblage that you can remove. You pull the top part, aided by a string inside. I mean a spring. You can pull that to remove the glass, but you can also pull the knob element, to change the wick. It's so many things are articulated together. Things are connected, but not in a kind of permanent connection. They are, for me, well articulated. So I use this as an example, as an object, as a kind of a ready-made, to expand my, ideas around articulage. So I have, I started with adding text to the surface of the glass. This said a bouquet of sublimated desires, repeatedly, just to reflect on my practice and, things that I have read and that I am still contending with. This was exhibited in a niche that was, because I'm interested in, with the lamplight, significantly with the lamplight, I go back to my childhood, in Malawi, where electricity is, intermittent, sometimes it disappears. I grew up in, we'd have blackouts, and the lamplight would be, you know, a viable alternative to electricity. So I would sit at the dinner table and just marvel at this, you know, beautifully made object, you know, pull the top and, you know, like play with the knob and so on and so forth. And so I'm coming back to it to, you know, to reflect on those experiences, you know, how when you lit it, the shadows would dance on the walls, and, you know, the entire environment would be animated. But I would also look at this as a kind of a human form with arms, head, and a torso, and so on. So I am coming back to this object as an animist, you know, an animist in the sense that I am continuing the animation, you know, going back to childhood, but animating it further by contorting the glass, but also heightening the elbows of the arms, you know, in a Deleuzian sense, you know, creating a monster out of it, animating in a monstrous way. It becomes something else other than the standardized kerosene with these different heightened parts. I call them totems because I see myself as an animist, you know, animating these. But yeah, but it's mostly, you know, there is the material, the physical component, but also the light and the shadows, you know, and how they dance around, you know. Here, you know, in Richmond, sometimes I just, you know, pick one up and light it and, you know, just marvel at the shadows, you know, the lights, and continue inhaling the kerosene that I inhaled when I was a kid, you know. Yeah, but I have created several of these. I don't usually work like this, but because of the pandemic, I've had to go back to, you know, to dig into series of objects and just, yeah, focus on a particular project. So there are different characters and different totems that I have created. Each has its individual peculiarities and idiosyncrasies and, yeah, characteristics, and, you know, yeah, this is a double entendre totem, you know, because it has two tanks rather than the top part. You can light it, you know, from both ends. Could also be an hourglass, you know, but it's just opening up the horizons while I animate that. Perhaps I should now reflect on what I call the patois bourgeois animists. But before that, a few words, let me just say a few words on articulage. So articulage is a way of linking my practice with theory and other networks of other ideas and attitudes. As an element of a praxis, it is derived with and alongside and not determinant of the work. It is about the languages with which I connect theory with practice. It is a way of finding connections and disconnections, conjunctions and disconjunctions, and resonances and dissonances between theory and practice, and of gleaning meaning within and around praxis. So in articulage, theory shapes practice, while practice shapes theory. This is not to negate the power of the inarticulate, the extralinguistic, and the ineffable, cognizant of the fact that the articulate and the inarticulate can both be powerful constituent parts of an assemblage of poetic meaning. In fact, articulage asks, what possibilities emerge in the in-between if we fashion assemblages of the articulate and the inarticulate, the linguistic and the extralinguistic? At some point, you know, the linguistic had been a dominant feature in my work, perhaps taking center stage. But I am also now deeply considering the extralinguistic and placing them side by side, thinking about the textual and that which is beyond, and how they interact with each other in the work. So the spiritual and magic assemblages of odd animism described above shed light on and empower this dimension of articulage. I expand on this concept through an aspect of my work below. So the Patois bourgeoisie is a series of work. I'm not going to deal with it much. Yeah, but let me just quickly rush through the images. And yeah, so the Patois bourgeoisie are basically the petty bourgeoisie from where I'm from. Like they're different from the bourgeoisie of Europe. And I look at Kamuzu Banda, the first president of Malawi, as a quintessential Patois bourgeois. And here he is with his suit and three-piece suit, bowler hat, walking stick, and a fly whisk. And he is with you know who. But I want to draw your attention to the party cloth that the women are wearing in the background as they cheer, as they welcome the prince and the Patois bourgeois to Malawi. I created my own party to just reflect on Patois bourgeois politics, and the party has its own flag. You know, I launched the party at 1708 with all its colors and party flags, and it had a party symbol in the form of a chameleon, a motto, a complete manifesto. He who gave us teeth should give you art to see. It is not promising anything. It is a kind of a hostile Patois bourgeois party. You know, they need you during campaign season, but you know, there are no guarantees. But it's a Patois bourgeois art because it's about politics, but it's also about art. So I was just digging into, you know, meanings of the words there. So this is a view of the party launch with a platform and party posters. So different party posters saying different things. This is another view of the launch. But on the party platform, there is you know, the podium. The structure is already being overtaken by termites. So the edifice is already rotten even before it started. The Patois bourgeoisie, a hybrid bourgeoisie. So while they are Western educated, they also are deeply connected to their indigenous roots. So they take recourse to charms, to magic charms, to protect themselves. So for example, this party here, they already brought the magic charm. So to lure, you know, to win over the masses. So the charms are placed in different corners of the podium. But there is a statement there also: performance is postponed to next elections, just to let you know, but performance here would be performance, the art performance, that the podium looks like it is ready for a performance, but it's also performance in the sense of these politicians are not going to perform. One poster read, "To make more Barry-head in the sand art," but it has been vandalized by the opposition. But by vandalizing it, you know, the word "pa" is bourgeois, like the father is bourgeois, emerges rather than patois bourgeois. This is to make get-laid art, which has been transformed by vandalization. Serendipitously, it becomes, serendipitously in quotes, it becomes to make more get-aid art. So, you know, just to expand meaning, pa is bourgeois. This one is to make more ego massaging art. When it's vandalized, it says to make more go massa art. But this is also a way of just reflecting on myself as an artist producing in a hyper-productive, in a system that pushes you to hyper-produce, also to hyper-consume, and just reflecting on my own position as a neoliberal artist in the system, and resisting that hyper-productivity. This is to make more tenure-driven art, which is self-explanatory, but this is not a to make a tenure-driven talk, I promise. Do I have time to just briefly reflect on this articulage?
Of course.
Okay. So considering that central to articulage are materials and processes of linking, and that it is also a kind of speculative theory for other possible linkages, it is imperative to reflect on how the concept as critique. But let me mention that I look at the patois bourgeoisie as an articulate because they link the West or the East with the masses on the African continent. So they are like the ticks or the pollen in that assemblage of domination between the West and the rest. So they are an articulage element. I see them as an articulage element. That's why I introduce them in this talk. But considering that central to articulage are elements and processes of linking, and that it is also a kind of speculative theory of other possible linkages, it is imperative to reflect on how the concept as critique is inspired by and resonates with the praxis of decolonial thinking or decolonial delinking. Decolonial thinkers such as Walter Mignolo urge us to delink from coloniality, meaning to say the domination, oppression, exploitation, and dispossession that is constitutive of and supports the Western project of modernity and its toxic epistemes. For Mignolo, and I quote, decoloniality names the vision and the energy of delinking to relink with praxis of living, thinking, doing that we, decolonially speaking, want to preserve. Decolonial delinking resonates with what Ariela Aisha Azoulay calls rehearsals of disengagement from imperialism. According to Azoulay, rehearsals of disengagement consist in repeating and reactivating what others have already said, performed, or written at different conjunctures before us, when they were subjected to different modalities of imperial violence. As an Algerian Jew, Azoulay adopted her grandmother's suppressed Arabic name, Aisha, as a personal rehearsal of disengagement. During the period of formal decolonization in Africa in the 1950s to the 1970s, some members of the African elite delinked from their bourgeois political affiliations and joined the rising oppressed in what Amilcar Cabral, the Guinean revolutionary, called class suicide. Some of these members of the elite led the struggles for decolonization that resulted in the independence of the formerly colonized. You know, one member is Amilcar Cabral, or another would be Frantz Fanon, and you know, there are numerous others. They were bourgeois, but they decided to, you know, forego, you know, even after independence. Ngugi wa Thiong'o writes about students who opted to join workers and peasants fight on a clear program of a national democratic revolution in the Africa of the 1970s. Decolonial delinking, rehearsals of disengagement, or class suicide all describe processes of disinvestment and disconnecting from colonial or imperial assemblages. Articulage, or in this instance, to put it more precisely, disarticulage, echoes those practices to speculate on the process of the patois bourgeois elite delinking from continual coloniality. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing this amazing work and thoughts about it. And I could not help but think of how relevant this work and especially the examples you gave at the beginning of your talk, with the suitcase, the baby coats, right? Thinking about rehumanizing, right, spaces of displacement, how relevant this is to our contemporary moment where, you know, multiple forms of displacement continue to happen. And, you know, especially with the war in Europe right now, we see these images on TV. We have one question already in the Q&A, and I'm going to ask you to continue to post yours. And also, if you'd like to raise your hand, I can unmute you so you can ask your question live. So let's start with Aidan Lears, our colleague from the English department. She says, thank you so much for this wonderful talk and for sharing your work with us. I love your investment in the vitality and animacy of objects. And I wondered if you could speak to the relationship between such animation and the enchantment you mentioned in your bio. In other words, does your investment in vitality help you to enchant or re-enchant your life? And if so, how?
Yeah, yes, that's an important question. Thank you. Yeah, I think the enchantment here is a kind of animist enchantment. As I mentioned, that the simple, ordinary, mundane lantern is, contorted, elongated, and maybe things written on its surface, and it becomes something else, something more fabulous. And the shadows that it throws on the walls become something else that takes me beyond, the mundane space of the everyday that I am in. So, but this is in connection to, how enchanting a child's life, like simple things can enchant and be wondrous, be amazing to a child, like, how I could spend, hours and hours just, just watching the flame of the lantern dance and throw these animated shadows and apparitions on the walls. So that's the kind of enchantment that I am thinking at the most basic level. But art is a way of generally enchanting my life, like imagining other ways of being, something beyond. Sometimes it's it could be use irony, if I am allowed to say, but like the way that a part of a bourgeois party, the symbols and the colors have been twisted, and the statements, things done to them, that humor as a way of re-enchanting everyday life. So people went into the exhibition and saw these different aspects, different textures of the work and colors and sounds. And there was a sound component. There were masks that were dancing to Kamuzu Banda's speeches, and just making interventions into his statements. Like I edited the sound in a way that it's like the masks are poking fun at what some of the things that Kamuzu Banda is saying. He's at Buckingham Palace with the Queen, and he's heaping praises to the Queen. You have done this to my country, you have fed my people, and so on. So when he says things that the masks are happy with, so enchantment, like with the sound system and the colors and everything, it was kind of enchanting my life, and enchanting a party, enchanting the lanterns and so on.
Yeah, and this goes back to your point about working during the pandemic as well, and choosing certain materials or specific object, right, to animate that sort of life, or to re-enchant life during the pandemic. I don't know if you want to talk to that specifically, but I see Michael Keane raising his hand, and I would like to give him a chance to ask his question live. So Michael, you are on.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Hey, Massa, that was a great lecture.
Hey, thank you.
I guess a question about animist thinking. So, I'm thinking of the idea of the turn, like in philosophical circles, like the turn towards a kind of materialist thinking, or the turn towards a kind of continental thinking, or the turn towards a kind of, the turn. And it feels like animism has been part of a series of turns, and in particularly this moment that we're living in, and the ways in which we seem, we seem to have lost control in so many aspects of our life. And if we talk about the neoliberal project, it's like the ways in which we become subjects to a kind of series of oppressive forces. We can get deeper into that, but you could say one anecdote to that is to shrink things down, or actually to start to imagine a kind of magical thinking where that's a way to just be present in a world where things are so messed up. And I'm curious, tied to that, I guess, would be another idea where it seems like, if I think of Efflux, for instance, like Efflux loves to talk about animism as a philosophical project, which is really different than the practice itself of enchantment. So I also wanted to kind of try to untangle maybe two different threads in relation to an ideology of animism as it might exist just as a philosophical concept, versus actually enchanting materials, like being with objects, like imagining the sort of spiritual extra dimensional sense of matter.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for those reflections. Yeah, I am as an artist, perhaps I am existing somewhere in between, in the sense of on the one hand, the animism of Efflux, and on the other hand, the animism of the post-humanist turn. I skipped some notes here that we're gonna touch on, these the post-humanist or animist, these conversations, which is a kind of continental philosophical thinking that has been challenged by other ways of thinking. Perhaps some of these other ways of thinking are what Mignolo is urging us to relink with. But yeah, on the one hand is that post-humanist animist turn that urges us to recognize that we are at the same level with, these materials and objects and, the non-human and so on and so forth. We are in this world, in this planet together. It's being theorized and philosophized, and yeah, as you put it. On the other, there is the animist that has always been there, like on the African continent, it's not a theorized academic animism, an animism that has, been practiced. It perverts everyday reality. Perhaps to draw from, you find, like, yeah, the way that trees, there's the animism of worshiping trees, but there's also the animism of, how people engage with objects in everyday life, or animals in everyday life, right? If you find a mother speaking to a god who is trying to eat her flower, or her vegetables, and is, speaking in a funny way, like they're speaking to a human, but it's an everyday thing. African societies have been derided for let's say living with animals, yeah, but that hierarchical or de-hierarchized relationship with the animals and the non-human, the technological objects and so on. I like Achille Mbembe's, seeing that happening with what we do with phones, that we in our assemblages in advanced society, we are doing something similar, perhaps perverted, but similar to what the old animists, or the animists elsewhere are doing. But I am I am in the in between because I've been influenced by the animism back home, but also the animism of, of the academy. And but I'm finding my own language in the in between, to articulate and rearticulate or disarticulate it.
Thank you so much for the great question and of course for your answer, Massa. We have about 3 questions. I'm not sure if we'll have time to get through all of them, but Jonathan, who is actually a fellow at the HRC this semester, asks, how does articulage make room for omission or refusal of speech? I'm thinking about the Blackboard sketch and how it ends on the statement, "Let's not go there," which to me speaks about putting up a boundary or a limitation to knowing. And he asks, how does articulage deal with what can't be said or what can't be articulated? Great question, Jonathan.
That's deep, but I think I'm looking at this blank page in front of me with just this word disarticulage as a way of disconnections. Perhaps disconnections and delinkings would be some of the kinds of omissions that maybe Jonathan is touching on. Yeah, but that's an interesting question. Yeah, but perhaps if I continue to expand on the concept of disarticulage,
right?
Disarticulage would
Jonathan says, I'm sorry to interrupt. Jonathan says that definitely helped. And our colleague in GSWS, Chris Shin, says the "let's not go there" might also be read as a refusal of particular genealogies or paternal legacies, as you described earlier. There was a question earlier in the chat before we go to Stephanie Jones's last question, and it asked you about the connection. So does art have a role, is the question. Does art have a role in connecting the bourgeoisie and the public? And if so, how can it be applied in countries like Malawi?
I missed the word, I think, in the statement, one key word at the beginning of the statement. So can you repeat?
Sure. Does art have a role in connecting the bourgeoisie to the public? And if so, how do you see this applied in countries like Malawi? I think you talked a little bit about this when you addressed the patois bourgeois world, right, as an articulage element, talking about the petit bourgeoisie from Africa. But I think I think Lloyd Mataka asks specifically about the Malawi context.
So the question is saying, how does the patois bourgeoisie connect with the
art? If art has a role, if art has a role in connecting the bourgeoisie and the public, which I think you explained quite well in your presentation.
So the word art is what I was missing.
Okay.
Yeah. Maybe it has the potential, maybe it has a potential because this kind of artistic practice, that I have just, the images that I've showed is not a dominant form of artistic expression in Malawi. In other parts of the African continent, yeah, it is booming, but in Malawi, contemporary art, as we understand it, is not. But the people, the public, they have forms of creative expression. Performance, I said performance is a dominant, it's a pervasive form of artistic, creative expression rather, in funerals, in everyday rituals and marriage ceremonies and, friends meeting and, performing, friendship, performing grief, performing, alliances at political parties. So creative performance perhaps, but performance as a Gule Wankulu mask, as the Gule Wankulu mask is one form of, dominant cultural expression. So it ties but it is a creative form of the proletariat, of the, you know, the poor, you know,
Working
the
class.
peasants, and
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
the bourgeois, what you would call the bourgeois art forms are more, they're in enclosures. They do not really connect with the exhibitions are done in exclusive spaces, you know, where the masses, the poor people do not have access to. But there is creativity that pervades, you know, the society. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I appreciate the answer. And one last question, sorry, in the interest of time, and thank you to all of you who are sticking around. I think it's most of you in the audience. Stephanie Jones says, I'm very appreciative of your work and the time you've taken to speak with us. Would you mind talking through how you balance the importance of flexibility when forming these heterogeneous links while ensuring your inspection of the quote unquote disputed social space we all live in remains in focus, or remains a focus? The works / words of freedom fighters and revolutionaries are so often appropriated that I became anxious in my creative work as a Black femme. Thank you so much. Thank you, Stephanie. How do you balance the importance of flexibility, right, when forming these connections, while also ensuring your inspection of these social spaces remains in focus?
I can say that you know, perhaps, yeah, this is another profound question, but
it is. Stephanie, you can ask your question. You have been unmuted. If you'd like to ask this live, please go ahead.
Okay, hello, thank you again. So yeah, I really am just talking about how you ensure that the message of your work, particularly, you know, when it comes to the dehumanization of dark-skinned people and migrants, when you are showcasing your work, how do you ensure that audiences aren't walking away like neoliberalism and capitalism swallow so much? Like, how do you ensure that your work and your messages remain intact, even with the flexibility that Articulage has inherently?
There's, you know, there's gonna be sleeps, you know, there's gonna be sleepages. You know, the meanings, I bring meaning, you know, depending on what is urgent to what I'm saying in the work. You know, there is a degree of control of the meaning that of what I want to express. But of course, the viewer is also bringing in their own ways of reading the meanings. But I think my work has been, most of my work, but perhaps the dominant artwork that I can refer to here is the political party. It's been a straightforward kind of artwork that, you know, you can, you know, upon encountering it, you can tell. Say, for example, if you're from Malawi, that you know, Massa is lampooning, you know, the neoliberal patois bourgeoisie. You know, how does it do that? By appropriating the language of the neoliberal patois bourgeoisie themselves. So he's trying to subvert it, you know, you could say, from within, even though I am on the outside and commenting from, but I'm borrowing the language, like detuning the language and upturning it and, you know, giving it back to the bourgeoisie. And it's there is a conversation to be had, you know. But also here in the US, you know, where the exhibition was launched, it was a more of the critique into the art spaces, you know, the art system within which I operate. So that was perhaps the dominant, you know, the dominant message, that which I think in the conversations that I had, you know, people read, so they worked through that. But I also understand that there would be other meanings that would, you know, slip, would spiral from, you know, the meanings that I create. We are still contending with how we can create work that does not get swallowed up by the neoliberal art world, you know. sometimes we use it, we steal from it, to get the resources so that we say the things that we want to say, But yeah, there is a way that you seek to have one foot within the systems, to be able to get the resources, but also to be outside, outside the system. I don't know if there is any space that is outside the bounds of neoliberal, extractivism, in the sense of extracting, whether it's cultural capital or whatever capital. I have made work with a collective. We sought to exhibit on the lake shores of Lake Malawi, where we were just dealing with the fishers there. Well, the work has moved on to other platforms, but it was a way of just, art is always in the spaces of the gallery and the museum. And well, let's have the studio right where we show it, where we produce and show it, and we have conversations with people who do not have usual, contemporary art world conversations, the fishers of Lake Malawi. But still, even the lake shore has also been already, overtaken by neoliberal extractivism, in the sense that it is literally being threatened by capitalist extraction. So we have to contend with these issues everywhere, but that does not stop us from, continuing having these conversations.
Absolutely.
Regarding theory, regarding theory, I'm sorry, let me just, regarding theory, like the Frantz Fanons and the Amilcar Cabral, that's what I have been reading. It's like in traditional African conversations, Malayan conversations, you have proverbs that help you to make sense of reality, or sometimes, to help you to understand certain situations and events, behavior as well. So these are like scaffoldings, the theory, the statements that have been made by these people are scaffoldings in the conversations that I'm having. In theory, in my theory component, my writing component, but it also feeds into, it articulates, it is articulated, re-articulated by my practice. So there are interconnections between the practice and the theory. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Stephanie, for a wonderful, wonderful question. And with Dr. Mosabel here in the chat, I agree with them that you have given very thoughtful answers to all the questions. And I'm just very grateful for a refreshing talk. And I hope you'll come back again. And I look forward to speaking more with you about poetry and art. And I just love everything about your talk. Thank you so much for speaking with us today, Professor Massa Lemu, and thank you all in the audience for sticking around. For those of you who couldn't make it or who had to leave early, recording of this event will be posted on our website soon. I'd also like to ask you to mark your calendars for our next event at the HRC in the series Meet VCU Authors. Right after spring break on Monday, March 14th, we'll be welcoming Dr. Jessica Trisco-Darden, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at VCU, who will speak about several of her recent book projects. The very timely topic of her talk, again, just like Professor Lemu's, is, quote, Left Behind, Understanding U.S. Foreign Assistance and Political Violence in Afghanistan. We hope to see many of you and your students at this and future events. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. Thank you again, Professor Massa Lemu.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for supporting the HRC, and we look forward to continuing to follow your work and to future conversations.
Thank you.
Thank you.